So I want to talk today about behavioral finance, or about psychology in finance. This is a long-standing interest of mine. I've been involved with it for over 20 years. It's not really emphasized in your textbook. Fabozzi and his co-authors talk about a lot of things in the financial world, but not about the underlying human behavior. Behavioral finance, or behavioral economics more broadly, is a kind of revolution that has occurred in finance and economics over the last 20 or 30 years. And it remains somewhat controversial. I don't quite fully understand why it is that people polarize as much as they do, but some people don't like this. Other people, I think, we're coming along to be the majority, I think. People are now regarding behavioral finance as an important element of finance. And so the real problem is that people are complex, and our financial institutions, as I've emphasized, are designed for real people, and their functioning depends on the behavior of real people. And it's not as simple. You know, another revolution that's occurring parallel, of bigger significance, is a revolution in neuroscience about the human brain. And the human brain is a very complicated organ. And it's not. Economists have liked to invoke the principle of rationality as an underlying component of their theory, and that has been useful, but it's of limited use because people aren't rational. They're often rational, they're not completely rational. And very often people behave stupidly. I'll put it that way. That includes everyone, including me, because we're human and we have limits. And that encourages, one thing about the human species is that we are aware of other people's weaknesses and have an impulse to exploit them. Okay, so when you see other people behaving stupidly, sometimes you think, maybe I can turn this to my advantage. Okay, and that becomes a problem. The history of humankind is a history of exploitation of one person by another. Not entirely, but I'm saying it has that as an important element. So I'm going to talk about these human failings. It's not to say that people are stupid. I'm just saying they're people, right? And we're all imperfect. We're smart in some dimensions, and we can be very smart, but we can also make important mistakes. But before I start, I wanted to try to put this into a perspective, because maybe I'll return to this at the end of the lecture. But I wanted to start on an upbeat note. I'm going to talk about all kinds of human errors, but I wanted to start on an upbeat note that the business world generally doesn't exploit people terribly. I believe that very characteristically successful businesses in finance and elsewhere consider their long-term advantage and the reputation they have. So doing something that is blatantly exploitative of human weaknesses will work against their long-term advantage. And so we don't see, you'll see a lot of human failings, but we don't see people cashing in on them as often as you'd think. And beyond that, I want to emphasize also that another aspect of human behavior is morality. Evolutionary biologists think that this evolved along with our other traits, that we have an impulse to be moral. And so in the long run, you might not really gain so much satisfaction from exploiting other people's mistakes. And so you don't necessarily do that. So that's why we'll have a lot of weaknesses outlined, and we won't see significant or serious exploitation of them as characteristic. Now, I, as you know, I have chapters from my forthcoming book assigned for this course, and I look back on what I put up for you to read, and I keep thinking, gee, this really wasn't ready. So I had a chapter for this section of the reading list about behavioral finance. And I thought, I didn't really get it right. I know what I was trying to say, but maybe I should. What I start out in that chapter is talking about Adam Smith, okay, and his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, just to remind you, Adam Smith was a professor at, I guess, in Scotland, that in 1759, he was a professor of moral philosophy because there were no professors of economics in those days. And he wrote in 1759. Maybe I should write some of this on the board. He's probably the most important figure in the history of economic thought. So in 1759, he wrote his Theory of Moral Sentiments, and in 1776, he wrote the more famous book, Wealth of Nations. So this is the Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Wealth of Nations is considered the first real treatise on economics, and it's a wonderful book, and it's still very readable today. His Theory of Moral Sentiments is not so widely read, but it's not really economics. It's a book about psychology and morality. And I find it very good, even 250 years later. He went through many editions on this book because he thought it was his most important work. But the book starts out about selfishness and altruism. And the real question, which he thinks defines economics, is are people really completely selfish? Sometimes it seems that way, that their presumed benevolence is just an artifice for their own benefit. But he wonders, how does an economy work if everyone is totally selfish? And he ends up concluding that they're not. I thought it was very interesting the way he put it. The thing he emphasized right at the beginning of the book is that people inherently love praise. All right? We crave the approval of other people. And so praise is a fundamental human desire. But then he reflected on it and he said, do people really want praise itself, or is it something else that they want? And he said that, well, think of it this way. Suppose people made a big mistake and thought that you had accomplished something, but there was a mix-up. You know, it was really somebody else who did it, not you. And it's just a complete mistake. You had nothing to do with it. But you find lots of people praising you. Would that really be pleasurable? And suppose you even know that they'll never find out that I didn't do it. Well, Smith said, it probably isn't, right? I mean, think about it. You internally are thinking, I'm getting all this praise, but I know I don't deserve it. So I don't enjoy it. And then he went on to say that, especially among people who are more mature, he says more mature people, not everyone makes this step, but he says adults, normal, mature adults, make a transition from a desire for praise to a desire for praiseworthiness. I want to know that I am the kind of person who will be praised, and I don't need to get the praise. And he said it's that tendency, ultimately, which makes an economy work, that people don't care just about praise. And he gives an example of mathematicians. And he said he's known many mathematicians in his life. And he finds that they're almost all obscure. The public doesn't know about mathematicians. They couldn't explain to the public what they do. And they don't seem to care at all because they know the public doesn't appreciate mathematics. And so there's a few mathematician friends who understand what they do and may praise them. But ultimately, a mathematician can sometimes do the work completely unknown, writing it, and it's the praiseworthiness that drives these people. So I think that you may think that I'm being too idealistic when I say this, but I think that the finance profession, this is what I was trying to say in that chapter, that the finance profession, like other mature professions, is really dominated, although there's a lot of funny things that happen, is really dominated by people who have reached this desire for praiseworthiness. And so you're not going to exploit people extravagantly, just because why would I do that? It's just not a good thing. I wouldn't feel good about it. Though some people will. Now, I wanted to also mention, not everyone reaches this mature state that Adam Smith describes. And that's one of the complexities of human society. And I think that the finance profession has a problem with other kinds of people. Now, there's a whole branch of psychology called personality psychology that categorizes people by their personality. And we're not all the same. And in our society, we have many different kinds of personalities. A successful society promotes people up who have the praiseworthiness desire. We try to recognize them, and we try to put people of character into important positions with not complete success. But I wanted to just briefly talk about, this is a lecture on psychology, and I wanted to talk about other personality types that are, and I was going to use a book called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, edition 4, published by the American Psychiatric Association. They're coming out with a 5th edition in 2014. DSM-4 is kind of a household word around my house because my wife is a psychologist. And so DSM-4 is actually controversial among psychiatrists because it's too cut and dried for some of them. What it tries to do is identify mental illnesses and personality types in a quantifiable, reproducible way so that we can define who has this mental illness or who has this personality type. And so it gives you checklists, and it says, the patient must have exhibited at least 3 of the following 5 behaviors. And then there'll be another checklist. And so you keep score, and you can actually diagnose personality disorder. I'm just going to mention one. They have many personalities disorders. One of them is called APD, called antisocial personality disorder. And so they have checklists, but just to give you a sense. And the antisocial personality disorder is called psychopathy, or one kind of APD is psychopathy. Another one is called sociopathy. And I don't know, there's a huge literature on these. But according to DSM-4, 3% of the male population in the world is APD, okay? And 1% of the female population. A simple definition for APD is a jerk, okay? But there are more male jerks than female jerks, apparently, according to their. This is all quantifiable and done. But what is an antisocial personality disorder? It has the following characteristics: lack of remorse, frequent lying, lack of empathy, superficial charm, shallowed emotions, distorted sense of self, constant search for new sensations. Have you met someone like that? You probably have. because that's 3% of the population. I'm not anti-male when I point out there are 3 times as many jerks among males as females. Females have characteristically different personality disorders, and you can look down the list. So it's much more than 3% of the population that would be diagnosed with one or the other. So you know what an APD person is? Manipulative, feigns affectionate or warm feelings but doesn't feel them, and is trying to deceive you. And I encountered once a student came to my office and asked to sign up as my research assistant. And I was talking to him. I thought, well, maybe, I said, come back and talk to him. Later on, I read about him in the Yale Daily News. He was an imposter student. He was not a Yale student. And he had been around to other university campuses. He was an imposter at like 3 different campuses. So there's something wrong with this person, right? Kind of made me feel... Then he came later and asked me for a recommendation letter. I couldn't believe it. After I read about him in the Yale Daily News. But this is extreme, right? And so, incidentally, someone did a study of APD by going to a prison and categorizing the inmates using DSM-4 standards, and they found that 40% of the prisoners had APD. Also, neuroscience people have found that there are differences in the prefrontal cortex that are correlated with APD. So it seems to be, it's a problem we have in our society that some people have a brain structure that's a little different, and it may make it difficult for them to behave in a good way. So we're learning more and more about neuroscience, and it's interesting to me that Adam Smith's book still rings true, though. There's some basic common sense that we all learn, that you have to judge people and you have to learn their character, and you have to be a person of character, for in the long run, that's what you want. It gives you what you want in life. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to turn now to, another thing I want to say at the beginning is that people are manipulable, unfortunately true. And unfortunately, we live in a world where it's hard to avoid manipulating people at all, because we have a free enterprise system that encourages competition. And if the competition is manipulating people, how do you completely stay clear of that? And I think this is one of the contradictions of our society. And a very simple and obvious manipulation is they'll put a price on some item they're selling, like $9.99, all right? So you ask, well, why didn't they just say $10, right? Well, you know why they didn't. It's called pricing points in marketing, because $9.99 sounds a lot less psychologically than $10. So everyone does it. Almost everyone does it. But is that bad? Well, it's bad in a way. It's manipulative, isn't it? I mean, I'm annoyed by it. Maybe you are too. But if you were in business, would you do that too? You might feel that you have to, and it's a harmless sort of manipulation, right? It's not hurting anyone really. They may be buying a little bit more than they want, but you see, that's the kind of thing that that comes in. So in looking at financial institutions, they're often manipulative in that sense. But I don't think that it's similar to a politician. If you want to be a member of Congress or whatever, you can't say what you really believe, right? Because you won't get elected. You've got to kind of doctor your opinions to the public opinion, and so otherwise you won't have. But you might have a moral purpose underlying it all, because you want to get elected so you can do good things, and so you do end up saying things. So it's hard to judge people, good or bad. It's an overall sense you get of someone's character, that people are doing things that appear somewhat manipulative and somewhat bad, but you get an overall sense of the person through time, and that's and ultimately our society, within limits, rewards people that show character through all the confusing details. Now I wanted to move, that was my introduction, I wanted to move now to discussing some particular aspects of behavioral finance, or more broadly, behavioral economics, and about human failings that are exploitable by somebody, but and are somewhat exploited, but remain as... I wanted to start out with what's probably the most famous element of behavioral economics. It's prospect theory. And it was invented by two psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And in the late 20th century. They called it prospect theory because it was a theory of how people form decisions about prospects. And a prospect is a gamble. It's about people's decisions under uncertainty. And in very simple terms, the prospect theory says, now there's a huge literature on this, so I'm trying to give you a very quick description of it, that there's something called a value function, which represents how people value things, and there's a weighting function. That's the two parts, which shows how people infer or how they deal with probabilities. Okay, and I'll just show simply what the Kahneman and Tversky says. I'll draw a picture of the value function and the weighting function. And this will be very quick, and you'd have to read more. But the way people value gains or losses, let me see, how do I better draw the line in the middle. Okay, and these, we're talking about financial gains. So these are gains, and this is zero, and this is losses. Well, negative. What I have on the horizontal axis is wealth or money or something like that. Zero in the middle. Okay. And then we have on this axis value, which is something like utility. I'll erase my zero. It doesn't get in the way. And what they find is that people's value has a funny shape. We don't weigh gains and losses linearly. In the positive quadrant, when we have positive gains, there's diminishing value like that. It doesn't ever slope down. It's concave down, like diminishing marginal utility in economic theory. But for losses, it looks something like this. It's concave up. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this is a diagram that Kahneman and Tversky wrote in their famous Econometrica article 30 years ago. So there's diminishing marginal utility for gains, but there's the opposite. Well, we have concave up. And there's a kink. You note that the value function has a kink at the origin. So what does this mean? It means, and then, okay, first of all, this origin is from what point do I estimate gains and losses? That's called the reference point, and it's psychological. And it's subject to manipulation. The reference point is the zero from which I measure things. The kink, so that first of all, it's the reference point is probably today's wealth, but it can be something else if people are manipulated. by the way something is presented to them. Framing, according to Kahneman and Tversky, is presentation. So I can give the same prospect to people, but word it in different ways that suggests a different reference point, and that will change people's behavior. So you can manipulate people by describing something in different terms, by suggesting a different reference point. But typically the reference point is today's wealth. The kink means that people are very conscious of little changes in their wealth, and they're spooked by them. I'm really afraid because my value drops very rapidly, even for a small loss. So if you were to say, lose $5 this morning, all right, you had it in your pocket and you lost it on the way to this lecture, you would feel exaggeratedly bad about that. You should really regard $5 as just nothing, because the present value of your lifetime income is in the millions, so what's $5? But you don't think that way. And so you're spooked and deterred by small losses, and less encouraged by small gains. So this kind of thing allows business people to exploit people if they want to. If people are so focused on these little changes, then you are encouraged in business to try to pick things out that people are paying attention to, like small things, and sell insurance policies on just those things. And so insurance should be concentrated on the really big things, like life insurance. You know, the fact that one of your parents could die and the family would be out of money for the rest of their lives. That's a big thing. But it may not work to sell that kind of insurance. You can do something that is more focused on what people are watching and make it something little so that it doesn't require them to spend so much money. The classic example of that is funeral insurance. Okay? You go around telling people, if for some reason this sales pitch works, and it's worked for thousands of years. They sold this in ancient Rome. Right? You tell people, you know, if someone in your family dies, you could have an expense of getting a proper burial for this person. It costs money. And so they would insure that one thing, okay? And it was a little thing, so, but it works to sell that. An example of that is airline flight insurance. Okay, you are insured for this flight on the airplane. Okay, I heard an ad for funeral insurance recently. They're still doing this after 2,000 years because it still works and it's manipulative. That's not what you should do for people. You should not pick out some little thing. Or they also have diamond ring insurance. After an engagement, some women will want to buy an insurance policy on the diamond because it can actually fall out of your ring and you lose it. But that's like, what is it, $5,000, something? It's not big, it's not essential. And if you're insuring that and not other things, you're making a mistake. But fortunately, the insurance industry is not it has come around to do things that are more, they are doing things that matter and are big. And that's because this Kahneman-Tversky value function is an it represents an error that people are prone to be making, but it's not total and not complete. And so ultimately, people don't go to insurance companies that manipulate them. It gets around, and eventually people come around to wanting something better. And so while there is some manipulation, it's limited. The other aspect of Kahneman and Tversky is the weighting function. Okay, and it's. I'm going to draw again a picture of it, and it's this time. It's how people psychologically think about probabilities. And this again is Kahneman and Tversky. A probability is a number between 0 and 1, or 0 and 100%. I'll put 0 here and 1 here. We can tell someone the probability of something, but they can't accept it psychologically. The errors that people make are described by the weighting function. What the weighting function is, the psychological impact. You are behaving as if you don't understand the probability. So what Kahneman and Tversky say is that for very low probabilities, people may round them to 0. And for very high probabilities, they may round them to 1. But if they decide not to round them to 0 or 1, they exaggerate the difference between 0 and 1. You just can't think in terms of a continuum of probabilities.